Good morning.
Good morning.
Glad to see everybody came out today. I'm very excited to tell you that we've pulled no stops on this one. We're going to have cake available. Okay. We don't normally have cake, so that's a little gift to you. There's also at 11:30 going to be the opening of the Robert C. Byrd exhibit. So I believe there's going to be hors d'oeuvres as well. So that's a twofer that we don't normally give our speakers. I only say that because a couple of them are in the crowd. They'll ask for the same thing. Coming up, we've got a couple of our lectures coming up. On July 2nd, we have Joe Comm. He's going to talk about Rock Spring Park, which was up near Chester. That's where I guess it's the dog track is now, and the casino. So he's going to be down here on July 2nd. On August 6th, we're going to have Jerry Sutphin. He's going to talk about the Great Kanawha River and river transportation in West Virginia. He worked on the documentary on the Kanawha River that I think came out about a year or so ago. In September, we're going to have Dr. Bob Barnett, and he's going to be talking about sports in West Virginia. It's going to be called Hillside Fields, The History of Sports in West Virginia. It's a book that he had come out recently. For those of you who have not gotten enough West Virginia statehood and West Virginia history, there's going to be a whole series of lectures tomorrow in the House Chambers. At 10 o'clock, there's going to be Dr. Carolyn Stewart. She's going to talk about minorities' contribution to West Virginia statehood. At 11 o'clock, we're going to have David Corbett. Some of you may know David Corbett. He's going to talk about his book, Senator Robert C. Byrd and the Brothers Kennedy, America's Longest-Serving Senators Encounters with America's Royal Family. There's going to be a portrayal by Mary Lincoln at noon. At 1 o'clock, we're going to have Dr. Billy Joe Payton, who's going to be talking about wheeling Charleston and the floating capital. The biggest travesty, I might add, as far as I'm concerned. But at 2 o'clock, we're going to have David Hunter Strother portrayal. Hunter Lesser is going to talk about Lincoln's odd trick, heroes, rascals, and rogues of West Virginia statehood. And at 4 o'clock, I will be speaking on a talk called No Ordinary Task, the Stout Hearts who founded West Virginia. So come on out and see that. That'll be tomorrow in the House Chambers. But today, we're fortunate enough to have Dr. Sheehan-Dean here, who is the Eberly Professor of Civil War Studies at West Virginia University. He's the author of Why Confederates Fought, Family and Nation in Civil War Virginia, which came out in 2007, and the Concise Historical Atlas of the U.S. Civil War. And he's also the editor of several books. He teaches courses on 19th century U.S. history, the Civil War and Reconstruction, and Southern history. So please welcome Dr. Sheehan-Dean.
Thank you all. Good to see everybody here this morning. Not only cake, but there's funnel cake out front that you got to pay for, and barbecue. So I'm good, calorie-wise, for probably a week, I would guess. No, it's a lot of fun to be here, and I wanted to start by thanking Commissioner Randall Reed Smith and Secretary Kay Goodwin, who had invited me to come on down and speak during the sesquicentennial activities. I grew up in Michigan, and that state had its sesquicentennial in 1987, so I've had more practice than many people at just saying sesquicentennial. That was our biggest problem on the commission. Just skip to 150th and let's call it that. I can also testify the festivities here have been much grander than what I remember, which consisted of 150 on Mackinac Ridge. It was about all we got in 1987. And I didn't see the fireworks last night, but I will be looking for them soon on YouTube. And I understand they were quite spectacular. The last person to thank is Dean Bob Jones at the Eberly College up at WVU, where I teach. Eberly Ideas is a lecture series that they started recently to try to get faculty out sharing their knowledge, as it were, with people. And one of the folks who gets to share, I get the benefit of going around and meeting people and seeing parts of the state that I wouldn't ordinarily. So it's a really neat program, and particularly nice to be here this weekend. Over the last 2.5 years, we as a national community have had a lot of time to think and talk about the Civil War. Some of that has been serious historical debate. Why did Southern states secede? What were the turning points in the war? Why did the North endorse emancipation? And some less so. The secession ball in South Carolina I would count in this category, as well as YouTube videos of Civil War reenactors battling reenactors from the video game Halo, which you can find as well. Within West Virginia, I've had the good fortune to serve on the state sesquicentennial commission, so I know all of the work being done in local communities to commemorate, remember, and consider the Civil War. My daughter finished 4th grade last year, and so I know what the curriculum looks like in terms of secondary schools and the work that they do with this. And I think it's fair to say that having absorbed that, the standard narrative of West Virginia statehood is widely accessible and widely known. More so than in any other state where I have lived, people here know where their state came from. Citizens understand the disputes within Antebellum Virginia that created the animosity between East and West, and they can identify the state's early leaders and history. And because that basic story is well known, I thought I would spend my time this morning thinking about the broader meaning of West Virginia's statehood and independence. So in what follows, I hope to explore the motives that encouraged West Virginians to remain loyal to the Union and consider how the rest of the country understood that decision. What difference did it make to the war and why? And asking what kept West Virginians loyal is, I think, a different question than asking why West Virginians created their state. The latter was an opportunity that emerged only after West Virginians had proved their loyalty to the U.S. It was a reward, in essence, for sacrifices already made. It was the effect of a deeper cause. When we think about wars historically, we tend to believe their meaning is fixed. The French Revolution overthrew an emperor and helped establish democracy in Western Europe. World War II rid the world of the Nazi menace. We rarely conceptualize the way our wars look different to those we fought alongside or even against. The Great Patriotic War, as the Russians called World War II, killed at least 25 million civilians, over 12% of the country's population. Consider by comparison that the U.S. lost about 1%. The war exists in Russian history as the kind of calamity that can scarcely be comprehended. It's rarer still when we recognize that the meaning of wars change over time. Shifts in interpretation come slowly, but take on deep power in American history and life. Today, if we polled most secondary students, not my daughter who gets an earful at home, but normal students, I would say, and ask why the Civil War was fought, they would probably respond, to free the slaves. As a professional historian, I'm obligated to note that this isn't a historically accurate assessment, but as a professional historian, I have limited control over popular memories about the past. When the war ended, most white Northerners, and certainly most white Southerners, would not have said that the Civil War was about freeing the slaves. The reasons for this shift are complex and generally derived from both good intentions and sound historical practice. They're really beyond the scope of my talk today. But I think we can take for granted that the standard narrative, the traditional one now understood in American schools and in popular ideas about our past, is that the Civil War was about, and I use that kind of passive framing because it's the common one, was about emancipation. The history of West Virginia statehood tells us a different story about the meaning of the Civil War. It is, by today's standards, a revisionist account, one that harkens back to how most participants thought about the war. West Virginia was not created as a state to further the northern goal of emancipation, though it did that too. West Virginia was created in order to demonstrate the loyalty of white Southerners to the Union, in order to prove that the democracy of the United States merited support and affection. I know most of you probably don't think of West Virginia as a southern state, but in today's West Virginia, in 1860 rather, today's West Virginia was the westernmost part of the Old Dominion, the largest and most prosperous slaveholding state in the Union. Over 500,000 people held in bondage in Virginia. Although people in this region may not have had much in common with Louisiana's sugar planters or the cotton nabobs of Memphis, they were considered Southern nonetheless. And it's this context for which I think it's most important to think about and understand West Virginia's statehood and what it meant in 1863. Why did West Virginians stay loyal to the United States? This decision made them among the only white people living in the slave states who refused to join the Confederacy. In East Tennessee, Unionists predominated, but the people of that region were firmly ensconced in a slaveholding state well out of reach of Northern armies. In other regions, especially the backcountry of North Carolina, Northern Alabama, Northeastern Florida, Unionists established a viable presence, but again, not in the numbers or position to declare autonomy. The context of these places, far removed from the North in terms of physical proximity, differed significantly from Western Virginia. So what explains the decision of those Western Virginians? What did the United States represent that compelled such sacrifice from its loyal citizens? Now, I think there are two ways to frame the answer to this question. One that goes back to Virginia's early history and that's chronicled both here and on the larger placards out front. And then another one that's sort of a shorter story that zeroes in on the spring of 1861 The former is a real long story and the latter a short one. I'm going to try to give them both justice very quickly here because they have different flavors to the final recipe of how to account for Western Virginians' loyalty. Virginians living west of the Shenandoah Valley developed deep grudges against Easterners during the Antebellum decades. Although white settlers reached the Appalachian Plateau long after Tidewater, Virginia, it was the state's fastest growing region in the 1840s and 1850s. More people, more industry, more dynamism, and less political power. From the early colonial period, Virginia's state government had favored large land and slaveholders. Apportionment, taxation, and development policies all privileged the wealthier East. Because Eastern power was based partly in their slave economy, and because a similar reliance on slavery did not take root in the West, Easterners harbored suspicions that their kinfolk over the mountains might prove unreliable on protecting slavery. In reality, Westerners expressed little antipathy to slavery and harbored almost no actual advocates for abolition. In this sense, Western Virginians acted like most other white Northerners in the 1850s. Although they did not desire or use slaves themselves, they had little objection when other people did. A small group of vocal free labor advocates, many involved in the industrial projects around Wheeling and the Northern Panhandle, opposed the use of slave labor. But I don't think it's even fair to call them anti-slavery, certainly not abolitionists in the way the term was used at the time. What actually worried Western Virginians were the ways that the presence of slavery seemed to disrupt the operation of government within the state. They believed that Eastern elites, and consequently the Richmond government, had only a shallow commitment to the rights of non-slaveholders. It took until 1851 for the state legislature to revise the state's apportionment system, and even then they retained a mixed system, in which representation was based partly in white population and partly in total population, which of course benefited the slaveholding regions. Westerners saw themselves as the victims of both political shenanigans and economic injustice. The main political issue in the state through the 1840s and 1850s was where and how much to spend to build the state's infrastructure. Residents of the more recently settled and more geographically diverse, not to say mountainous West, desperately wanted investment in their region. Compared to building a railroad across the mostly flat Tidewater or even the Piedmont, putting one through the valleys of Western Virginia was a tall order and required state bonds to generate support and capital. Throughout the colonial and antebellum eras, Westerners received relatively little help from the state. Despite the increasing importance of the region within the state, the Richmond government persistently made Western Virginia a low priority for internal improvement projects, canals, railroads, and turnpikes. These are not flashy technologies by today's standards. My students often have a hard time understanding what would have gotten people excited about a canal, right, which involves sort of a narrow channel and a couple of mules pulling a barge at maybe 2 miles an hour. And even most of the railroads at the time, of course, rarely break 10 miles an hour, which is convenient because they often disrail and you can sort of get them back up before anybody wakes up. But these technologies are the kind of bedrock of early 19th century economic expansion. So cutting the long story very short, we can safely say that by 1860, Western Virginians had good reason to protest their treatment in state politics by an Eastern regime that condescended when it could be bothered to notice the region. The other story that I mentioned has to do with the secession of the state and the ways that it confirmed all the long-standing fears and suspicions of Westerners. The fight within the state over Virginia's secession re-inflamed all these old problems. Eastern slaveholders controlled the direction of politics during the secession winter and spring. Although they were not all pro-secession men, Virginia Unionists actually controlled the state secession convention until about April 13th. Their power reminded Western Virginians that they were essentially irrelevant in the political life of the state. Chester Hubbard, a secession convention delegate, complained about the process that, quote, "I should like to show those traitors at Richmond that we are not to be transferred like cattle on the hills or the slaves on their plantations without our knowledge or consent." A correspondent of Francis Pierpont asked him whether, quote, "the people of Western Virginia will be dragged into this infamous Jeff Davis government. If they do," he wrote, "all I can say is they deserve to be slaves." This perspective, in fact, suggests an important parallel between the seceding states and West Virginia that few people at the time observed. After Lincoln's election by Northerners in 1860, and exclusively by Northerners, remember the Republican Party has no Southern base at all, fire eaters complained that the election only proved the irrelevancy of Southern voters. They weren't necessary to the operation of the federal government anymore. So if anyone should have been sensitive to Westerners, that is Western Virginians' demands, that their interest be taken seriously, it should have been Eastern slaveholding elites. Ultimately, however, Easterners had the votes, and they used them to carry the state out of the Union after Lincoln called up troops in response to the clash at Fort Sumter. And I should note here that we need to distinguish between Northwestern Virginians and Southwestern Virginians. Without rehashing a complex argument at length here, we need to recognize that many, probably a large majority of Southwestern Virginians, supported secession. Whether we use votes for the secession ordinance or enlistment in Confederate armies, as our statistic, it remains undeniable that the southern tier of counties in the state did not express the loyalty that characterized the Northwest. So while at times I may speak generally about Westerners in what follows, I mostly intend to apply my argument to those in the Northwest of the Old Dominion, or the northern tier of today's West Virginia. And I'll try to talk a little bit more specifically about this issue later on in the talk. The fighting in early 1861, sort of coming out of secession, exacerbated the deep cleavages between Eastern and Western Virginians. They may have shared a legacy of statehood in history, but almost as soon as Eastern soldiers arrived in the region to contest the advance of Union General George McClellan or to respond to his quick success, they disliked what they saw. You observe from the caption of this letter that I'm back again in this miserable hole, Winchester, John Winfield wrote to his wife in September 1861. Called here suddenly and yesterday from Shepherdstown to prepare for a while another wild goose chase in the mountains of Hampshire, called away from the face of a foe to seek one in the jungles and hills of a poverty-stricken region. Earlier in the year, another wrote home from Pocahontas County. This is the meanest place that ever had a name, and I wouldn't leave here for anything in reason. And if it wasn't that the Yankees might get to Richmond through this way, they are welcome to the whole country about here, as far as I am concerned. Still another agreed that a division of the region would benefit everyone. Although Western Virginia abounds in that grandest natural scenery, I am perfectly disgusted with the country and think we would be benefited and not injured by a division of the state. The comments, the bitterness in these comments reflected embarrassment over Confederates' defeat in the region, but also a deeper sense of alienation among the people of the two regions. Despite the claims of the Richmond government that the state was inviolable, these are claims they maintained all the way through to 1865, at a deeper level, many residents knew that these were distinct places. And just for the record, many Western soldiers that traveled east wrote back descriptions of the Tidewater just as disparaging as those I've quoted here from Easterners about the West. Antebellum Virginians did not always know their fellow state residents, and exposure during the war did not always kindle a sense of solidarity. The historical writing on West Virginia statehood has sometimes tended toward the romantic. Mountaineers are often presented as the truest and most virtuous of all Civil War Americans, and their decision to remain loyal is cast as a question of unalloyed patriotism. Offering more accurate and honest appraisals of Western Virginians' actions during the crisis of secession and Civil War, however, does not necessarily require abandoning the old interpretation that stressed pre-war issues of democratic governance and fairness to yeoman voters. Consider the explanation offered in one of the reports issued by the First Wheeling Convention in May 1861. Government is founded on the consent of the governed and is instituted for their good, and it cannot be denied that the course pursued by the ruling power in the state is utterly subversive and destructive of our interests. We believe we may rightfully and successfully appeal to the proper authorities of Virginia to permit us peacefully and lawfully to separate from the residue of the state and form ourselves into a government to give effect to the wishes, views, and interests of our constituents. Sentiments like this appear time and again throughout the debates in the First and Second Wheeling Conventions and in the discussions of the reorganized government. The first state constitution offers illumination on these points as well, and suggests that supporters expected the new state to replicate the best features of the pre-war Union, or at least those features of which Northerners were most proud. The old apportionment system was solved by basing the legislature on the white population. The new system was replaced the old county courts with townships, a more decentralized form of local government, required printed ballots instead of the voice vote system then in use, and established a system of public education. These provisions did not make West Virginia a model democracy, but they certainly indicate a preference for a more accessible system. Some conservatives blanched at what they considered the Yankee innovation of townships, for instance. They were more than enough to convince Republicans in Congress that the state merited admission to the Union. But one important hurdle remained. At the December Constitutional Convention for the new state, Reverend Gordon Battelle introduced a provision calling for gradual emancipation that precipitated, quote, a kind of tremor, a holy horror visible throughout the House, according to one witness. And things went downhill from there. A solid majority of members of the reorganized government and delegates to the Constitutional Convention opposed emancipation. Supporters of statehood believed that including an emancipation provision would kill any agreement for breaking up Virginia and creating a new state. As Henry Deering explained to Wakeman T. Willey, "I have my fears that Battelle and his little party will bring up the subject, and although they will not be able to carry his proposition, yet it will produce disturbance, not only in the convention, but elsewhere in our state." Instead of adopting Battelle's provision, the convention included a Negro exclusion rule in the first draft that would have prevented any black people, slave or free, from moving into the new state. But astute politicians recognized that Congress would never approve a new slave state, and that a region with 378,000 people, of whom only 18,000 were slaves, or less than 5% of the population, slavery would never develop anyway. Willey understood the importance of including gradual emancipation in the version of the Constitution that went before Congress, and successfully incorporated this provision into the final draft. Despite the opposition of conservatives, John Carlyle is the most famous, and he of course abandons the statehood project altogether. A popular referendum on statehood passed 18,000 to 500, and gradual emancipation, voted on separately, received surprisingly wide support, passing 6,000 to 600. But this popular support did little to change the minds of West Virginians conservatives, that is, most of the men in the reorganized government, and they continued to oppose statehood when coupled with emancipation. This quick history does not cast West Virginia's record on emancipation in a flattering light today. Many of the state's leaders had to be forced into adopting it. But this only means that West Virginians do not possess our moral perspective on slavery. Rather than compare historical attitudes with our current ones, a more useful way to think about West Virginia's attitudes towards emancipation and toward independence and statehood is to compare the region to other slaveholding border regions in the North. Missouri and Kentucky were the largest slave states that remained in the Union. Maryland and Delaware also remained loyal, but held much smaller and in fact declining slave populations. Just as in West Virginia, the President and Congress encouraged Union men in these regions to emancipate their slaves voluntarily. Lincoln offered federal funds to help compensate slaveholders for their financial losses. He entertained colonization as a solution for freed people, and it actually funded a colonial effort on a Caribbean island. This is an effort that ends in disaster. But just like in West Virginia, conservatives in these states refused. Lincoln and his representatives lobbied throughout 1862 as they watched the advance of armies through Virginia and Tennessee destroy slavery even before he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. The prospect of emancipation turned many slave state Republicans against Lincoln. As one embittered Kentuckian described it, conservative Unionists fought their own kith and kin to save Union and uphold the Constitution, and while they were away from their homes, Union soldiers and officers were stealing their slaves. Missouri eventually succumbed to the pressure and revised its state constitution to abolish slavery in 1864. Kentucky refused to the bitter end. Slavery in Kentucky ended only with the enactment of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in December 1865. The state only ratified it in 1976, and this proves Lincoln's argument, in essence, that slavery was safer in the Union than out. Slavery ended in the Confederacy before the Union. In comparison to border state Unionists in these two places, West Virginians adopted gradual emancipation with remarkable speed and absence of rancor. On another important question, West Virginia stands out from other slaveholding border regions, the nature of wartime governance. Here again, Missouri is instructive as a comparison. Both places included large loyal and disloyal populations. Both sent more men to fight for the Union than the Confederacy, but they sent more than a few of the latter. Both states divided horizontally into spheres of influence controlled by pro-Confederate and pro-Northern wings. But the Lincoln administration experienced dramatically more difficulty controlling Missouri. The administration was forced to adopt restrictions on civil liberties in Missouri, including the arrest of pro-Confederate newspaper editors and on occasion ministers that anyone feared or contemplated in West Virginia. Here's what Lincoln said about Missouri, quote, and this is in a letter to state leaders: "It is very painful to me that you in Missouri cannot or will not settle your factional quarrel among yourselves. I have been tormented beyond endurance for months by both sides." Whatever quarrels West Virginians had among themselves, and they were many and serious, they could at least assert confidently that they had never tormented Lincoln beyond endurance. The guerrilla fighting in Western Virginia was severe. probably worse than we know, because it is, in comparison to other Civil War topics, understudied. That is, it doesn't have hundreds of books on it, only dozens, let's say. Lincoln and state leaders recognized that the boundaries they used for West Virginia created a new state with decidedly mixed loyalties. Residents of the counties south of Jackson, Roane, Calhoun, and Braxton volunteered in high numbers for the Confederate Army, and many opposed the division of the state. Nonetheless, West Virginia did not present the intractable problems of Missouri, where guerrilla conflict grew so severe that in 1863, Union General John Ewing issued General Order Number 11, which banished the citizens of 4 counties in the western part of the state, roughly 20,000 people, and ordered the destruction of their homes. Ewing's order stands alone in the history of the war. General Order Number 11 is a kind of totem word in Missouri, but its passage demonstrates the level of violence and destruction there that Western Virginians, luckily, never faced. Here are the conclusions I draw from these admittedly brief comparisons. Western Virginians, at least those in the northern half of the state, conceptualized the war as a test of democracy, not an opportunity for emancipation. The Constitution, the state Constitution, with Willie's gradual emancipation provision included, was ratified by an overwhelming majority of voters after Congress passed it. But the convention debate made clear that few in the state saw black freedom as a priority. Instead, they understood the war as Lincoln did, as a rebellion against a legitimate national authority, as the abandonment of law and order. Undoubtedly, Virginia's secession surprised West Virginians much less than it had Lincoln, who assumed late into the war that white Southerners would remain loyal to the Union. And Lincoln and William Henry Seward have this confidence, as I say, for a long time. It turns out not justified. Seasoned by decades of political conflict with Eastern Virginians, few in the West would have been caught flat-footed either by the rashness of Virginia's decision to abandon the United States or by their willingness to reject democratic government when it no longer protected slavery. But Virginians' profoundly undemocratic action created an opportunity for Western Virginians to build something better in its place. By late 1861, Lincoln understood and explained secession in terms that Western Virginians would have intuitively recognized. Quote, "The insurrection is largely, if not exclusively, a war upon the first principle of popular government, the rights of the people. Conclusive evidence of this is found in the most grave and maturely considered public documents, as well as in the general tone of the insurgents. In those documents, we find the abridgment of the existing right of suffrage and the denial to the people of all right to participate in the selection of public officers, except the legislative boldly advocated, with labored arguments to prove that large control of the people in government is the source of all political evil." End quote. The route to West Virginia statehood was hardly perfect by our contemporary standards of how a democracy should work, but it more than vindicated Lincoln's faith in the common people. It is true that Lincoln did not offer extensive commentary on the issue of West Virginia statehood. But what he did say about the war more generally indicates that the willingness of West Virginia's people to pursue democratic government, the rule of law, and loyalty to the Union was exactly the sentiment he hoped to nurture in other parts of the South. And so now I want to turn and talk a little bit about that national context. These were the predominant goals for white Northerners at the war's start and its conclusion as well. They were the sentiments of those military commanders that Lincoln came to prefer and support. William Tecumseh Sherman, for instance, proclaimed that the Union armies were, quote, "bound by one common cause, the union of our country and the perpetuation of the government of our inheritance." The idea was well expressed in George F. Root's battle cry of freedom, the most popular wartime song in the North. "The Union forever," I'm going to read it rather than sing it, which I assure you is better. "The Union forever, hurrah boys, hurrah, down with the traitor, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom." Root's lyrics express the urgency of the Union cause, the necessity of moving against secession in order to preserve democracy and freedom. Lincoln could have chosen to wait patiently or to negotiate seceded states back into the Union. Perhaps if he had stalled until the summer of 1861 and taken no action against slavery, men in the upper South states of Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas would not have joined the Confederacy. Their lack of support might have stunted the movement, that is, the movement of southern states, deep southern states, out of the Union, and proven that it was unnecessary. But Lincoln believed that the act of taking up arms against the government, what he's called resorting from the ballot to the bullet, and as the Confederate States did in their attack on Fort Sumter, required a military response. Not responding would have fatally weakened democracy. Lincoln would have agreed with the self-described Douglas Democrat, William Miller, in the 75th Indiana Infantry. Quote, "My democracy does not consist of being a rebel against the laws and government," he fumed. "It is a dissolution of the Union and the triumph of secession, or their surrender and the triumph of law and order." From the beginning, Lincoln conceptualized Western Virginia along with the other border slave regions, fighting internal battles to stay loyal to the United States. In his first annual address to Congress in December 1861, after cataloging where things stood with Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky, he offered this assessment, quote, "After a somewhat bloody struggle of months, winter closes on the Union people of Western Virginia, leaving them masters of their own country." Early in the Civil War, when Lincoln was asked whether the North had God's favor, he is said to have joked, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." If those were not his exact words, the sentiment was one that Lincoln expressed over and over. He needed Kentucky because he hoped that having the support of white Southerners from a slaveholding state would reassure moderates in the Deep South that their rights would be secure in a Republican-led Union. Lincoln possessed even higher hopes of soliciting the support of white Virginians. The creation of West Virginia presented the possibility of achieving that goal. Even if he overestimated the strength of white unionism in the South, Lincoln understood the risks that remaining loyal created for Western Virginians within the state. As the state's first governor, Arthur Bowman, described it, we, that is the loyal West Virginians, thus took our position with our eyes open, knowing what Civil War had been and what it could be once again if commenced. And we have not been deceived. Our state has been invaded by traitors in arms against the best government that a kind and beneficent God ever inspired man to make. Lincoln cherished this attitude and nursed it within the South wherever he found it, because it reflected his perspective on democratic government and because it helped erode the Confederacy and strengthen the Union in the war. In both sections, people assumed a short war after secession, if any was necessary at all. That's why Lincoln's initial militia call requested 75,000 90-day men. He figured 3 months would suffice to restore order in the seceded states. But by mid-1862, and especially with the repulse of McClellan's army from around Richmond, it was clear that the war would extend much longer in time. This was one of the reasons that Lincoln began contemplating emancipation, because it would deprive the slave South of military resources that could then be turned to the advantage of the Union. Throughout 1862, the ad hoc emancipation created by the escape of enslaved people forced on Lincoln an additional challenge in his administration of the war. Enslaved people fled their bondage by the hundreds, then thousands. They fled into Union lines and confronted Army officers with enormous administrative challenges. When they didn't flee, their labor sustained the Confederacy. In many southern counties, including some in the southern tier of this state, the enlistment rate exceeded 75% of the eligible men, and this is an astronomically high mobilization rate. It dwarfs the national enlistment rate during World War II by over 4 times. And it was only sustainable because slave labor on the home front helped produce the supplies to feed both soldiers and civilians. All of these problems collided in the Union's slaveholding border states, Maryland, Virginia, Missouri, Kentucky, and Delaware. There, slaves fled loyal masters, and Union troops were compelled to return African Americans to slavery. So for all of these reasons, administrative, manpower, and the political ones, Lincoln came to the conclusion by July of 1862 that slavery was doomed by the war. An independent and free state of West Virginia provided a model for the more reluctant states in the North. This is one of the reasons that Lincoln supported West Virginia's claim for statehood, particularly after emancipation had been made a precondition. John Jacob, editor of the Wellsburg Herald and an enthusiastic proponent of statehood, understood this. He believed that the wide margin of support demonstrated for both the new state and for gradual emancipation in the April 1862 referendum represented, quote, a blow at slavery that cripples the rebellion more than the defeat of an army, end quote. Lincoln wanted Maryland, or another full-border slaveholding state, to lead the way, but they refused. Maryland did not revise its state constitution to outlaw slavery until late 1864. In this respect as well, West Virginia led the way, demonstrating to other border state conservatives that emancipation should not force them from the Union. In addition to West Virginia's example on emancipation, Lincoln also desperately needed more territory added to the northern column of the war's strategic balance sheet. Remember how the war was going in late 1862 and early 1863 when Congress and Lincoln were weighing the wisdom of splitting Virginia. They were losing in the Eastern Theater and badly. It is true that Ulysses Grant racked up impressive victories at Forts Henry and Donelson on western rivers early in the year, and his victory at Shiloh forced Confederates out of Tennessee. But most observers focused on the Richmond-Washington corridor, and in that area, Lee's army clearly dominated. After McClellan's repulse from the peninsula in July, Lee's soldiers marched north, defeating Union troops at the Battle of Second Bull Run, and then fought to a draw at Antietam. The Battle of Fredericksburg in December was a bloody and embarrassing defeat for the North, and 1863 seemed to promise more of the same with Joseph Hooker's humiliating rout at Chancellorsville in May. Under a succession of commanders, the Union Army failed to make headway in Virginia. In the cabinet debate over statehood, Lincoln's Secretary of State William H. Seward explained how these goals fit together. He believed, quote, that it was essential to plant a free state south of the Ohio. This would effectively give the North more Union territory without the need for a battle to win it. The specific geographic position of West Virginia, which extended north of the federal capital and straddled the vital Baltimore and Ohio rail link, made it all the more important. A free state in Mississippi, for instance, would have been psychologically useful, and in fact, late in the war, Jones County, Mississippi famously secedes from the Confederacy. But West Virginia was strategically more important. Lincoln made this point plainly. Quote, "We can scarcely dispense with the aid of West Virginia in the struggle, much less can we afford to have her against us, in Congress and in the field." But the gains carried far beyond the region. What statehood helped accomplish benefited not just Western Virginia or the United States, but the whole world. In assessing the gains of the war, the New York Herald proclaimed that Union soldiers, quote, "have secured the perpetuity of that Union upon which the hopes of the oppressed of all climes and countries depend. They are the champions of free governments throughout the world." Beyond its strategic value, West Virginia offered a unique opportunity to Lincoln because, as I have argued earlier, one of the chief motives of Western Virginians was eliminating the presence of slavery because it corrupted the practice of democracy. Lincoln said as much in the Gettysburg Address, though we have become accustomed to reading that speech through the prism of an emancipationist perspective. Lincoln claimed that the deaths of Union soldiers at Gettysburg ensured, quote, "that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." This passage is typically regarded as Lincoln reinterpreting the Constitution in light of emancipation. But what he believes is most important about that victory is that for the first time, American government will be truly democratic. No longer would the 3/5 clause corrupt the legislative process. No longer would slaveholders, overrepresented in state houses, continue to rule from on high. Lincoln did not shrug off emancipation's effects on the free people themselves. He had long believed slavery represented a cardinal violation of human dignity and autonomy. But a true democracy promised emancipation and more. The evidence could be found for this proposition could be found in West Virginia. Westerners had complained about an unequal political system for decades before the Civil War. Specifically, their complaints centered on the way that slavery corrupted what they believed should have been the normal operation of democracy in the state. Mixed representation, as Easterners called it, ensured that slaveholders controlled the Richmond government and with it the banking, development, and industrial policies of the state. Western Virginians, more than almost anyone else in the United States, knew the difficulty of maintaining a true democracy in a slave society. Above and beyond all the grand ideological and constitutional arguments and even the mundane political ones, Lincoln was also driven to support West Virginia's statehood because of its simple practical necessity. When Lincoln posed the question of whether statehood was constitutional to his cabinet, they split, with half supporting the proposal and half opposed, the Attorney General on the opposing side. The procedures regarding how a new state could be created out of an existing one were reasonably clear and had been little used since the founding of the Republic. The most important element was the consent of the original state. Under this precept, Virginia had to agree to its own dismemberment. Lincoln recognized that the men claiming to represent the state in Richmond opposed its division. But he also recognized that those men had abandoned their loyalty and obligation to the United States, and with it, their right to play an active role in the state's legal governance. "Can this government stand," Lincoln wrote, "if it indulges constitutional constructions by which men in open rebellion against it are to be accounted man for man the equals of those who maintain their loyalty to it? If so, their treason against the Constitution enhances their constitutional value. To the contrary, the loyalty of Western Virginians merited respect. They had opposed secessionists in their own state to champion the values of the nation, and their voice deserved to be heard. Union men. This was the shorthand used in all of the discussions within the restored state, the Constitutional Convention, and regular communication among leaders in the region. It was not a term anyone used before the war, and it ceased to have meaning shortly after Appomattox. But in a divided state, being a Union man meant taking risks. That risk and the reason for it merited respect and reward. Lincoln himself noted that West Virginia's brave and good men regarded mission into the Union as a matter of life and death. They had been true to the Union under very severe trials. We have acted so as to justify their hopes, and we cannot fully retain their confidence and cooperation if we seem to break faith with them. Lincoln knew that one good turn deserved another. Recognizing West Virginia as a state gave him one more place to draw upon for manpower in the war. Even before the date we celebrated yesterday, Lincoln included West Virginia in his June 1863 call for more northern troops. He requested 10,000 loyal men from the state to help suppress the insurrection, militia duty being one of the obligations of free men in a Union state. The willingness of West Virginians to resist secession, to support the Union, and to volunteer for Northern armies reminds us of an important dimension of the Civil War that is often overlooked today. Disputes over slavery caused the Civil War, and emancipation stands as one of the signal moments in American and world history. But as the experience of West Virginia demonstrates, most white loyalists supported the Union because it represented, as Lincoln called it, the last best hope of man. That hope inhered in democracy, in a form of government that derived its legitimacy and its power from the common people. It may be hard for us today to appreciate the political power of union, indeed its near spiritual significance in American life, but that only demonstrates our historical distance from the mid-19th century. Late in the war, Lincoln was asked about his ability to determine the war's outcome and confessed that he rarely felt in control. Like a Mississippi River poleman, his job was to ensure that the ship of state did not crash on either bank, but the current carried it forward. One can sense that same sense of pragmatism in his summary of why West Virginia should be admitted as a state. It is said that the admission of West Virginia is secession, he wrote, and only tolerated because it is our secession. Well, if we call it by that name, there is still a difference between secession against the Constitution and secession in favor of the Constitution. For Lincoln, that difference was all the difference in the world. Virginia seceded from the Union in order to destroy it. West Virginia seceded from Virginia in order to preserve it. Thank you.
If you guys have any questions, I'm sure he'll.
Yeah, let me start there.
Okay, I got a question.
Yeah.
West Virginia had to pay Virginia $12 million, according to Supreme Court rule in 1950. They didn't get it paid until 1935. But the amazing thing, when I got the decision and looked at it, is, of course, why do we owe Virginia anything? They should still be paying us. We should sue them for reparations, damages, cost of mobilization. Wouldn't give a dime. They left the Union, and they got out from underneath the umbrella protection of the Constitution. So if you want to leave, leave. We don't have to pay the rest of it to stay with the Union. But anyway, that's just another argument. But it's in the state constitution. West Virginia agreed, and the Supreme Court referred to that. The undertaking is found in the provision of the Constitution of West Virginia, which conditioned her admission to the Union. Did Lincoln press us to put this in to make the thing appear a little more legal, a little more palatable, that we would pay our share of the state debt to Virginia plus interest? Our share of the state debt of Virginia owed in 1861 was the date they used. It was like $4 million, but the interest was $8 million, which made it 12. So why would we agree to pay Virginia anything?
Well, I mean, actually, on the narrow question, I don't know. I suspect there's somebody in the room that does. That is, was Lincoln pressing? I don't know.
Right.
I mean, Lincoln is certainly pressing to make this look as constitutional as possible.
Right.
So, you know, the reorganized government he regards as the lawful government of Virginia. And so part of that dismemberment involves, you know, just like you split up a marriage, you know, you have to sort of pay some, you know, you sometimes have to pay alimony to sort of compensate for work done or careers stalled or whatever. I mean, that's the kind of logic of it, and I think Lincoln would have seen that as a relatively small price. I don't know if anybody knows.
I don't think Lincoln had any.
He stayed pretty far away from
Right, when the Constitutional Convention's going on, it's statehood leaders who are, and the folks that are here are actually determining what the state constitution is going to be. His role in that is all nothing. Because for Lincoln, he likes the idea of a government rising up, being the restored government of Virginia. He is not really, when the West Virginia Statehood Bill is brought to him, he actually doesn't want to deal with the issue, because at that point, the Civil War becomes a revolutionary act by the creation of West Virginia alone. And then emancipation comes out on the same day. The paying for it is something I think was the argument that the folks were making who were taking the state away. Through Pierpont and the other folks, Arthur Borman is going to be sitting on that committee. You look at the folks who came up with that Constitutional Convention, most of them were lawyers. There were a lot of farmers on there as well. So the idea was they weren't being like the folks who seceded, they were actually taking the higher.
I mean, they're arguing they're the true conservatives, and so you sort of follow the rule on this. I mean, Virginia certainly suffers much worse economically. I mean, I understand why you don't want to pay them anything. You know, I mean, emancipation and then the fact that the 14th Amendment waives, essentially dissolves all of the Confederate debt, of course, is part of what put the South in such dire straits for decades to come, because all of that, all those Confederate war bonds just evaporated, as opposed to, you know, West Virginia gets the advantage of the greenback, which holds its value.
And they had to sue us for it. We offered it up in 1863, and we wanted it to all go away. And in reality, the creation of this archives is a result of that court case, because they had realized at that point that they did not have the documents and the information actually to defend themselves in that court case. So they started collecting stuff now, and the old stuff we have in our collection comes from that court case.
Grant and Lincoln would have rolled over if they knew we had to pay any money at all.
I'm sure that if you got him, you know, gave him a beer and asked, I'm sure he would have said, yeah, you don't owe them anything. To be sure.
First of all, your conclusion with Lincoln's word, secession in favor of the Constitution, that should be on our license plate. That should be the state motto. I think that is excellent. Secondly, you're absolutely right. From what I've read just recently, right before West Virginia became a state, Lee had arguably his greatest victory at Chancellorsville, came up the Shenandoah Valley right as statehood was approaching, and federal troops, as I understand it, left the state, went to protect Washington, and that left Wheeling, the whole northern part of all of West Virginia, for all intents and purposes, vulnerable to Lee's army. So it was very brave for West Virginians to engage in statehood, especially right when the time came. The Army of Northern Virginia was right on the threshold. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's an assumption among some people that because McClellan had such easy success early in '61 that sort of the region remained stable, and of course it doesn't. And we have, I think, very good histories of the battles that were fought here, the recognized battles that were fought in the state. We still don't have a good treatment of the guerrilla war in West Virginia, in Western Virginia. I mean, sort of the whole thing, all of the Trans-Appalachian region. And it's vital because in many respects, I think the war will get, I made the comparison here that West Virginia wasn't as bad as Missouri. I mean, there are pockets of it that are as bad as Missouri. And I think, you know, if we do more historical research on this, we'll find that a lot of that fighting, because the Union Army continually sort of comes and goes out of the valley, and also comes and goes out of farther west. And so what that means is people that are divided in divided communities fight back and forth continuously. And I think that left a bad legacy for a long time afterwards. But we really don't have a good sense of that story because there's not been enough work on the guerrilla conflict in particular.
Sorry for the comments. I did actually have a question. And the question was, Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia knew that West Virginia was leaving. And for years, literally 2 years, 61, 62, going into 63. My understanding is Virginia tried to bribe or otherwise politically control West Virginia to stay in the Commonwealth, and actually, if I understand it right, offered to put a railroad through the Canal Valley to try and buy off this part of the state. Do you know anything about all that?
I don't know about the railroad. I mean, they certainly, they ignore, they continue to call it lowercase w Western Virginia. all the way through the war. And as they refuse, it's just like Lincoln saying secession is unconstitutional. It doesn't happen. Lincoln calls the Confederate States the so-called Confederate States. You sort of always sense the air quotes that he would have been doing. Because when he talks about the Confederacy, he regards them as states out of alignment. And Virginians regard Western Virginia the same way. That is, it's sort of temporarily calling itself a state, but it's not the real thing. Obviously, the railroad is about 40 years too late. I mean, I hadn't heard that, but a big part of the disputes, of course, are infrastructure. And they had, I guess I would have said they had plenty of time to do that, beginning in the 1830s and 40s. They don't.
It's the Constitutional Conventions in 1830 is the one that really angers the folks in the West. And I would argue that's what unleashes this generation of folks who drive the statehood. But in 1850, the concessions made in that convention calm a lot of that anger and animosity. And actually, the between 1850 and 1861 is rather a calm period constitutionally for the folks in Western Virginia, because they do get white male suffrage to a certain extent. Those developments are coming through. You have the B&L Railroad coming through, the Northwestern Railroad. So it calms out over that time period. So by 1860, that's when a lot of that old animosity comes out.
Yeah, I mean, the 1830 convention, the state constitutional convention is one of these pivotal moments in American history that very few people pay much attention to, because the convention was actually one of the issues that they were convened to consider was emancipation in the state. It happens, unfortunately, the Nat Turner Rebellion happens basically on the eve of the convention. So men going to the convention sort of panicked about slaves rising up and cutting the throats of their masters. But had Virginia somehow, and the West is certainly encouraging this, both for questions of economic development, but also sort of equalizing how democracy works. Had Virginia emancipated, and the whole state then starts to gradually look much more like the western part of the state, the Civil War looks entirely different. If secession comes in 1860 and you have Virginia, which is still a southern state, and the largest southern state, and the richest southern state, and the most industrialized southern state, if that's a free labor state, the whole landscape is dramatically different. So 1830 actually, is a sort of key moment. And you had James Madison was there, John Marshall, I mean, they're sort of luminaries of this convention, and they botch it up entirely. And as Brian said, sort of alienate still more Westerners who were thinking, okay, now we're going to solve things. And it takes another 20 years instead, by which point I think 51 is sort of, it's too late at that point. Good question.
I would say what Howard said about these people were so brave who were there, and I have read a little bit about what they had to put up with in the Ordinance of Secession Convention, which I suspect you talked about yesterday. Remember that, but is there any, and I wanted to read their speeches and find out more about those people, because I think that they were very active after they managed to get out of Richmond after the ordinance passed. But I think I can't find very much.
The Virginia Secession Convention, all of the documents and all of the speeches are published by the State Library of Virginia. 1965, it's a huge set, it costs $1 million, because they didn't make very many of them.
Go down to Richmond.
In Richmond, but Bill Freeling,
Here too.
yeah, I mean, they're great to read, but I would say even cheaper than that. The historian Bill Freeling, just maybe 4 or 5 years ago, edited a little paperback book that UVA Press publishes called Showdown in Virginia, which basically tried to distill those 3 volumes of debates down into the highlights. And he's got, the Westerners are amply represented in there, and some of the best speeches that came out of that convention opposing secession they start in December, they start really in February, so sort of February to April they actually meet into May of 1861. And that book is called Showdown in Virginia, but it's just a primary source, an edited collection culled from that much larger. There's 3 volumes of debates and then 3 volumes of reports that the Secession Convention released. And certainly these guys in Richmond, they kind of gave a talk and they went back to their hotel and locked the door.
Yeah.
I mean, there were several of them that really feared for their lives in Richmond, because Richmond very quickly kind of went into hysteria mode. The former governor is, brandishing a pistol, on the floor, and, they're sort of getting ready for a coup if the convention hadn't seceded, which they voted in April 4th, they vote not to secede, sort of right up until the moment. So the secessionists are frustrated and angry that all of these conditional unionists and Westerners seem to still be controlling things.
Right.
You know, the fire eaters had already left the state and moved south.
Is
at that
there
point.
much, is there anything known about their activities after that? I mean, their speeches of what they were doing?
If you go to our website, we have a State of Convenience as our online exhibit, and we have a lot of the primary documents there. We have the proceedings of the conventions, what information we have. The Clarksburg Convention is probably the first one where they come back and Carlisle and Pierpont and folks speak, and that rallies them to go wheeling and start talking about what Western Virginia is going to do. But those are on our website. If you go to wvculture.org/history, and then we have a link for a Child of the Rebellion, which will take you to the link of all the things that we have done for the Civil War and statehood.
Yeah, I mean, the documents, the materials online are great. I mean, particularly if you want to read those speeches in the convention.
And we have them in paper form here too. They're old and dusty, and I've looked through them, so that's a bit of a haul.
On the subject of the delegates who scurried out of Richmond, John Carlisle leading the pack out, I think the Exodus. Do you have any insight on his thinking and his 11th hour reversal on statehood? Was he in the copperhead, do you think? Or,
Well, I mean, he was certainly a conservative. I mean, I think it was a historical puzzle for a long time, and the historian Richard Curry makes the strong argument that he's a copperhead at heart. And copperheads are the Democrats that don't really stay loyal. These are Democrats that oppose the war, and they're like the snake, poisonous snake in the grass, but it doesn't give you a warning. At least a rattlesnake tells you it's going to strike. So it's an apt. I mean, the Copperheads actually coined the term themselves, and it had to do with pennies, but they sort of celebrated it. That turns out, I think, to be a very slippery moniker. But I would say that, I mean, he's sort of a conservative who doesn't want to be told what to do. I mean, there clearly is, among those elites, there is substantial investment in slavery. I mean, a lot of those men that end up even at the conventions are slaveholders themselves. And so a gradual emancipation provision is kind of, half acceptable. They'd like to see compensation, they want to see a whole lot of things. But I mean, I think the charitable explanation is just like, the argument that I was trying to make here, which is they want real democracy, a kind of local democracy. They don't want to be told, even if they're doing what the union wants, they don't want the union telling them what to do, which is, Charles Sumner, a radical from Massachusetts, with whom they would have had very little in common, saying, this bill isn't going through unless we get immediate emancipation, uncompensated emancipation. And Sumner was one of the ones that really mucks up the works for them on that question. So, I mean, Copperhead is a pretty pejorative term among geeky Civil War types like myself. I think, and certainly the kind of quick shift in state government by the 1870s and the way in which the conservatives kind of take over again suggests that, in fact, just like in Missouri, in Kentucky, there's a new book out called Rebels on the Border that looks at Missouri and Kentucky. And it looks at them from really kind of the 1850s, but through the Civil War and then well into Reconstruction. It's a very similar arc to the story here in West Virginia of kind of pro-business conservatives that have very little investment in emancipation, very quickly kind of reestablishing order and control in their states, that is Missouri and Kentucky. And that slaveholding border region continues to be, it sort of stays, I think, ideologically consistent all through this period. And so, sort of temporarily, it looks like they're on Lincoln's side, and they are at root, but they are not ideologically aligned, certainly with the radical Republicans.
I have a question not directly tied to your talk today, but it deals with emancipation and Reconstruction. Is it correct to assume that the white Southerners ended up, after the war, with more representation in Congress than they had before, with the counting of your former slaves now as a full person? Did it give them more members of Congress?
Well, there's a kind of a three-step dance here. That is, when the war ends, Northern Republicans who are in control of Congress but don't have any Southern wing at all and want to be a viable national party, look at the math and say, wait a minute, if they become no longer slaves, that is, if black people are no longer slaves, they're counted as 5/5, not 3/5. And this was what Southerners had originally asked for, was 5/5, and Northerners wanted 0/5, and the 3/5 was kind of in between. So it looks as though the war is going to end and white Southerners are going to get more representation in Congress. So what happens is the first swing at this is you pass the 14th Amendment, and there's a clause in the 14th Amendment that we don't pay any attention to today, but there's a clause related to voting, maybe the third or fourth article of the 14th Amendment, and what it says is the federal standard will be that any male over the age of 21 will be enfranchised and should have the right to vote, and that's how we will tabulate, apportion members of Congress. If states choose to voluntarily reduce the number of adult men over the age of 21 who can vote, their apportionment will go down as well. And so what this means in practice is the 14th Amendment is saying if southern states choose not to enfranchise black men, they can choose that. But the result is they will go to 0/5. None of those black people will be counted forward for the state, so it will diminish. They will actually be behind where they were before the war. That principle would apply to the North as well because it's a federal amendment. But northern states have such low populations of African Americans, and many of those states don't allow black people to vote. I mean, in the territorial period, Illinois, Iowa, Indiana didn't even allow black people to settle there. They definitely don't allow them to vote, but that has no effect on the apportionment because it's usually less than 1% of the population is black. It's a very cynical way of either forcing southern states to enfranchise black men in order for the Republican Party to get votes, or to allow them to not enfranchise black men but then to punish them at the polls. It's not for another year later that you get a 15th Amendment that forces universal emancipation, universal enfranchisement for men, for adult men, without having it conditioned on this question of, or without giving states the ability to decide. So by the end with the 15th Amendment, yes, then southern states' representation actually increases in Congress. But Republicans are sort of satisfied with that because by that point they have African Americans in the South who are investing in the Republican Party, and so you get a mixed delegation from the South of Democrats and Republicans. It's not a kind of what we would think of, it's not how we typically imagine it, because that clause in the 14th Amendment was superseded by the 15th Amendment, requiring universal emancipation just for men, of course, over the age of 21. And not, of course, in the sense that women shouldn't have had it. Of course, because at the time, that really was not something that they were going to be considering, despite Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other people arguing that it should have been. Does that make sense? I mean, it's complicated constitutionally. I mean, it reveals in the 14th Amendment, I think, the deep cynicism of Northern Republicans. And again, on this question of sort of how radical are Northern Republicans, not all that radical. The 14th Amendment is really a moderate victory. And you can see it in this provision that will allow southern states to not enfranchise their black men, but to suffer the kind of apportionment damages as a result of that. Other questions?
I'm convinced the Lost Cause Literary School has so slanted mainstream history that people are proud to have a statue of Stonewall Jackson on the State House lawn.
I would say not just the literary form of that, but the cinematic. That is the Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, and then Gettysburg and Gods and Generals today have done more than a little to valorize the Confederacy, to kind of sand buff slavery off of it. So what you're left with are heroic Christian soldiers like Jackson and Lee. And it's a very curious thing, particularly in a loyal state. Or, Robert E. Lee's got a statue in the Capitol of, the U.S. House of Representatives, in the U.S. Capitol, the old House of Representatives. To let a defeated power put up statues to its victorious generals that sought to destroy the United States. It's the nature of a civil war. I mean, it's one of those things that will continue to rub for a very long time. I say to my students, I think, although I haven't traveled to Greece, I don't know that the Trojans and the Spartans and the Athenians are necessarily angry at each other anymore. Kind of work. I mean, this is where the history, the quiz bowl here and the state history competition is, I think, important because what you're getting is not a vested party trying to teach our students history, but in fact the state and trained teachers and historians and other people that are setting up what should be, I think, a more historically accurate story of how this.
I just asked Phil Campbell, who grew up in Richmond, who writes for the Gazette. He won, I believe, one of those Confederate awards writing in high school over in Richmond.
Yeah, well, I mean, they to this day still offer scholarships to college. And there are good reasons for writing the essays. You know, and that's a 100-year effort. The Ladies Memorial Associations began in Virginia in 1865 doing the work of reburying, but also reinterpreting the war. And Northerners let it go because it's mostly women doing it, and their assumption is women don't do political things. You know, if Jubal Early had started doing it, he would have been clapped in irons and thrown in jail. But women begin doing very active political work in this memorialization. You know, it's not until 1870, 71 that men try to take over what are the LMAs, the Ladies Memorial Associations, and there's a fight there. But it's a very, it begins almost as soon as the war ends. So.
There's a reason Grant's on $50 bill, not white.
Yes. The one we don't have, right? Yeah.
All right, that's it. Let's give him a round of applause.
All right, thank you very much.
Invite you guys to the Byrd Memorial, or the Robert C. Byrd exhibits opening in 15 minutes. Go join the reception.
Okay, great.
And cake, don't forget the cake. I got plenty of cake.
That's the